What if the most fascinating figures from across time could meet for the first time in the hereafter, free to speak as they never could in life? Welcome to History's Afterlife. Tonight, two men who knew each other well, yet understood each other not at all. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, Britain's indomitable wartime leader, defender of empire, a man who believed civilization flowed from London outward, carrying enlightenment through law and governance with the firm hand of experience. And Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the Mahatma, the great soul who believed truth and non-violence could topple empires, that a spinning wheel was mightier than a sword, that the lowest untouchable possessed more dignity than any emperor. Churchill famously called Gandhi a half-naked fakir and, as wartime Prime Minister, refused talks with him. Gandhi saw Churchill as the embodiment of everything wrong with the modern world, the worship of force, the confusion of power with right. Each man was utterly convinced of his own righteousness. Each man shaped the century through the force of his convictions.
Mahatma, I notice the spinning wheel is nowhere to be found. Perhaps you finally realized that theatrics, however moving, don't actually govern nations.
Winston, the spinning wheel is everywhere, my friend. It exists wherever people choose dignity over dependence.
Dignity? You call poverty dignified? You call ignorance noble? Gandhi, while you were spinning cotton and playing at revolution, I was preventing the enslavement of civilization itself. Tell me, where exactly were you when Hitler was marching across Europe? What was your position on fascism, precisely?
I opposed fascism as I opposed imperialism. Both are systems that deny human freedom. But I would not support one evil to defeat another. I would not help Britain fight for democracy abroad while denying it to India at home.
How magnificently pure of you. How wonderfully simple. While Jewish children were being murdered in gas chambers, while democracy itself hung by a thread, you chose moral posturing over moral action. Do you have any idea what the world would look like today if more people had followed your example of noble neutrality?
Your war was not our war, Winston. Why should Indians die for British freedom when Britain denied freedom to Indians?
Because, you impossible man, freedom is indivisible. Because if Hitler had won, there would be no dignity to defend, no moral authority to wield, no rights for anyone who wasn't part of his master race. Your movements of resistance didn't just challenge existing power, they undermined the survival of human civilization itself.
In 1940, Britain and the Commonwealth had stood alone against Nazi Germany when all of Europe had fallen. Churchill's wartime broadcasts were heard across the world. We shall never surrender. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent resistance had also inspired movements worldwide, but Churchill saw it as dangerously naive in the face of truly ruthless opponents.
Civilization, Winston? Whose civilization? The one that starved 3 million Bengalis while shipping their grain to British soldiers? The one that divided communities, exploited resources, and called it progress? What you defended was not civilization. It was empire, masquerading as righteousness.
Around 3 million people died in the Bengal famine of 1943, driven by wartime disruption, a 1942 cyclone, market failures and policy decisions. London prioritised military shipping and delayed large-scale imports, but historians still debate the degree of UK responsibility.
The Bengal famine was a tragedy of war, not policy. Japanese occupation of Burma, U-boat attacks on shipping, military priorities in a global conflict, these were the causes, not deliberate British cruelty. But you never let facts interfere with a good moral crusade, did you?
Facts? The fact is that grain was available but diverted. The fact is that your own war cabinet was told of the crisis and chose military considerations over human lives. The fact is that Indian lives have always been expendable when British interests were at stake.
Expendable? I made the hardest decisions any leader has ever faced. Let me tell you about one of them. July 1940. The French fleet at Mers el-Kebir. Our former allies, now under Vichy control. Those ships could fall into German hands, tip the balance of naval power, make invasion of Britain inevitable. I had to choose. Attack our former allies, kill French sailors who had fought beside us, or risk those ships being used to destroy everything we were fighting for.
So you ordered the attack. Over 1,000 French sailors died that day. Men who had been your allies, who had families, who were simply following orders. Yes, I know about Mers el-Kebir, Winston.
Then you know the weight of that decision. Do you think that was easy for me? Do you think I didn't feel the burden of every one of those deaths? But the alternative was worse. If those ships had joined the German fleet, how many more would have died? How many British sailors? How many civilians in London? How many people across the world if Britain had fallen?
I understand the calculation, Winston, but here's what troubles me. Once you accept that you can kill innocent people to prevent greater evil, where does it end? Every tyrant in history has justified his actions by claiming they prevented something worse. The means we choose don't just achieve our ends. They shape who we become.
And the means you chose? What did they shape you into? A saint who could inspire millions, but couldn't prevent the very violence you claim to oppose. At least my compromises achieved something concrete. Your purity led to the same bloodshed you sought to avoid.
Save the world or save the British Empire? Let us be honest about what you were really fighting for, Winston. Democracy for Britain, empire for everyone else. Freedom for those who looked like you, servitude for those who didn't.
Churchill had earned his reputation as Britain's wartime bulldog through years of confronting dictators. First Mussolini, then Hitler. His refusal to consider negotiated peace in 1940 had become legendary. But Gandhi represented a different kind of challenge, moral authority that couldn't be defeated through conventional political means.
You know what the real problem was, Gandhi? You never understood the alternative. You saw British rule as oppression, but you never seriously considered what would have replaced it. Princely states at each other's throats, religious warfare, economic collapse.
Which happened anyway, Winston, after centuries of British divide and rule policies. The violence of Partition didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the inevitable result of the very divisions your empire created and maintained to keep us weak.
Nonsense. We found those divisions. We didn't create them. Hindu-Muslim tensions, caste prejudices, regional rivalries. These existed for millennia. before the first British soldier set foot in India. We brought law, order, and unity to chaos.
You brought law that served British interests, order that maintained British control, and unity only in opposition to British rule. The moment you left, those artificial unities collapsed because they were never real. They were imposed.
And what was your alternative? Civil disobedience? Salt marches? Pretty gestures that made you feel virtuous while accomplishing nothing substantial? How exactly was spinning cotton going to industrialize India, educate the masses, or create modern institutions?
My alternative was self-reliance, self-governance, and self-respect. The spinning wheel wasn't about cotton, Winston. It was about dignity. It was about Indians learning they didn't need British permission to govern their own lives.
Dignity doesn't build railways. Self-respect doesn't establish universities. Good intentions don't create legal systems or modern armies or public health services. We gave India infrastructure, education, and institutions that took centuries to develop in Europe.
You gave India what served British purposes. The railways carried our cotton to British mills, not our people to prosperity. The universities trained clerks for British administration, not leaders for Indian governance. The legal system enforced British law, not Indian justice.
The argument reflects a fundamental divide that shaped the 20th century. Churchill genuinely believed in what historians call the civilizing mission, that British institutions, law and governance had lifted nations from poverty and chaos. Gandhi believed just as deeply that no material progress could justify the denial of basic human dignity and self-determination.
Do you know what truly mystified me about you, Mahatma? Your methods. This elaborate theatre of suffering. These fasts unto death. This passive resistance nonsense. If you wanted power, why not take it honestly? Why this manipulative performance of victimhood?
Because power taken by force becomes tyranny, Winston. Violence breeds violence. I wanted to show that moral authority could triumph over mere force, that right could defeat might. Your methods created the very problems they claimed to solve.
My methods saved democracy. My methods stopped genocide. My methods preserved the possibility of freedom for future generations. Your methods, what did they actually accomplish besides making you feel morally superior?
My methods brought down the British Empire without firing a shot. My methods proved that people armed with nothing but truth and courage could defeat the most powerful military force on earth. My methods showed the world a different way.
A different way? Your different way showed that moral authority could challenge established power. I'll grant you that. But it also showed the limits of idealism when faced with practical governance. Pure intentions don't automatically create pure results.
Both men had grappled with the relationship between means and ends throughout their careers. Churchill believed that sometimes immoral means were necessary to achieve moral ends. Gandhi believed that immoral means inevitably corrupted any ends that they achieved.
The violence that followed our movements broke my heart. But Winston, that violence was always there, suppressed by systems of order, waiting to explode. We didn't create it. We simply revealed what was already hidden beneath the surface.
Hidden violence? What romantic notion. Order prevents violence. It doesn't hide it. When you destroy the structures that maintain peace, violence naturally follows. That's not revelation. That's cause and effect.
But whose peace, Winston? Peace for whom? The comfortable always mistake the absence of upheaval for the presence of justice. True peace can only come when the causes of conflict are addressed, not when they're simply suppressed.
And true order can only come when someone takes responsibility for difficult decisions, for balancing competing interests, for choosing between imperfect options. You had the luxury of moral purity because others had to live with the practical consequences of your ideals.
Someone did take responsibility, Winston. We did. Indians took responsibility for our own governance, our own mistakes, our own future. That's what freedom means, the right to fail on your own terms rather than succeed on someone else's.
Gandhi's practice of fasting, sometimes for weeks, had become a powerful tool of moral pressure, forcing opponents to confront the human cost of their policies. The salt tax protests of 1930 demonstrated how symbolic acts could challenge entire systems of authority. Making salt from seawater became an act of defiance that inspired millions.
Freedom to fail? How generous of you to offer that to hundreds of millions. Tell me, Gandhi, when the Japanese were advancing through Burma, when they would have enslaved every Indian they could catch, was that the freedom you preferred? Death and slavery under fascists, rather than life and progress under British rule?
I understand your frustration, Winston. But when people resist tyranny, whether fascist or imperial, they do so because they believe freedom itself is at stake. The timing may seem wrong to you, but to us, the principle was more important than the convenience.
They were building death camps and planning invasions. Instead of fighting them, you fought the one power standing between civilization and barbarism.
The threat to the Allied cause was more immediate than many realised. Japanese forces had conquered Burma by May 1942 and reached India's eastern border. Japanese submarines operated in the Indian Ocean, and there were serious plans for a Japanese invasion of India. The Indian National Army, formed from Indian prisoners of war, was actively collaborating with Japanese forces, preparing to march on Delhi.
Do you have any conception of how many lives your moral compromises cost over the centuries, Winston? How many people suffered under systems you defended simply because changing them seemed too difficult, too disruptive?
The price of your principles was paid by others. Easy enough to fast when you're surrounded by disciples eager to feed you. Easy enough to preach non-violence when others do your fighting. Your hands stayed clean while India burned.
And your hands, Winston, are they clean? How many villages did you bomb? How many civilians died in your good war? How many Bengalis starved while you fought for freedom with methods that denied freedom to others?
Churchill had written extensively about the weight of wartime decisions. I felt as if I were walking with destiny. Gandhi had written with equal conviction about satyagraha, truth force. Non-violence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind.
You want to know the difference between us, Mahatma? I never pretended my choices were pure. I never claimed moral perfection. I made terrible decisions because someone had to make them, and I lived with the consequences. You made your choices and convinced yourself they were holy.
And you, Winston, did you convince yourself your choices were necessary? Did you tell yourself that empire was burden, that rule was service, that domination was civilization? Which of us was more honest about our motives?
I was honest about results. British rule brought India into the modern world. Railways, telegraphs, medicine, law, all the foundations of a functioning state. What did your spinning wheel create besides sentiment and symbolism?
It created something you never understood, Winston. The idea that Indians could govern themselves, that we didn't need British permission to be free, British guidance to be civilized, British protection to be safe. The wheel wasn't about cotton. It was about independence of spirit.
Independence of spirit? Pretty words. But spirit doesn't feed the hungry, doesn't cure disease, doesn't defend against invasion. You gave India independence of spirit and watched it collapse into chaos and bloodshed.
We gave India the chance to succeed or fail as Indians, not as British subjects. Yes, we failed in many ways, but they were our failures, honestly earned, not imposed by foreign rule. That's what self-governance means, the right to make your own mistakes.
By 1947, Churchill was out of office, watching the empire he'd defended his entire life dissolve. Gandhi would be assassinated within months of independence by a Hindu extremist who believed the Mahatma had been too accommodating to Muslims. Partition, the division of British India into separate Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, would claim over 1 million lives as entire populations fled across new borders, often facing massacre along the way.
Self-governance? You call partition self-governance? You call communal massacres a successful transition? Mahatma, if that's success, I'll take benevolent empire any day. At least under British rule, people could walk safely across the subcontinent.
Under British rule, people could walk safely as subjects, not as citizens. They could live peacefully as long as they accepted their place in your hierarchy. The violence of partition was terrible, but it was the birth pangs of freedom, not the death throes of oppression.
Birth pangs? Millions died, Gandhi. Entire populations were uprooted. Families destroyed. Communities shattered. And you call this progress because it happened after we left, rather than while we governed?
I call it honest tragedy, rather than disguised oppression. At least after independence, Indians could work to heal those wounds ourselves. Under empire, the wounds were permanent, institutionalized, made acceptable by law and custom.
You know what I think, Mahatma? I think you preferred the purity of resistance to the complexity of governance. Fighting empire was clean, simple, morally clear. Actually running a country, that's messy, compromised, morally ambiguous. That's why you stepped aside and let others deal with the consequences of your revolution.
And I think you preferred the comfort of dominance to the difficulty of equality. Ruling others was clean, simple, morally clear for you. Actually treating people as equals, that was messy, compromised, morally ambiguous. That's why you fought so hard to preserve a system that made you superior by birth rather than merit.
Churchill had spent 5 decades in British politics, serving as Home Secretary, First Lord of the Admiralty, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and finally Prime Minister. Gandhi had deliberately stepped back from political office after independence, choosing to focus on communal harmony and social reform until his death.
You know, Gandhi, I've spent decades trying to understand you, and I still can't fathom how you convinced yourself that suffering was preferable to progress, that independence was more important than prosperity, that principle mattered more than practical results.
And I have spent decades trying to understand how you convinced yourself that progress built on others' subjugation was real progress, that prosperity bought with others' poverty was real prosperity, that practical results achieved through moral compromise were real achievements.
As their voices fade, we're left with 2 men who shaped the world through the collision of their incompatible certainties. One building, one dismantling, both utterly convinced of their righteousness. Churchill, who saved democracy by practicing empire. Gandhi, who achieved freedom through methods that led to violence. Neither man ever doubted his mission. Neither man ever fully grasped the cost of his conviction. Perhaps that's the most human thing of all, the need to believe our cause is just, our sacrifice meaningful, our vision true. Whether we preserve civilizations or liberate peoples, we are all prisoners of our own certainty. And perhaps the only wisdom lies in recognizing that certainty itself, however noble, however necessary, is the most dangerous thing we carry.